There we go. Hi, Derek. Thank you so much for helping my project. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about yourself.
Absolutely. So I'm these days I work as a software engineer. First part of my career was doing a lot of scientific programming to support mathematicians and uh, physicists. And really, I think a lot of that was direct inspiration from the Apollo program. Um, when I was very young, I was just about 2 years old when the moon landing happened. And my folks tell me that uh, I came out, toddled out to the living room with one of my Mickey Mouse books that was like Mickey Mouse in a rocket ship, kind of pointed at the TV. And I was looking through some old uh, boxes of memories, and sure enough, here is, I guess, later that fall, I drew a picture of a rocket ship going to the moon,
Oh, that's
and
amazing.
with the moon and the stars there. So it left an early and strong impression, and because of this, I know that people, they would give me things that were moon or space related. A family friend arranged for me to get an autographed photo by John Irwin, I think he's the eighth man on the moon, along with a picture of him. I guess this is him on the surface. He was a lunar module pilot, and so these artifacts were kept very safe away from my young fingers, which I appreciate feel I have now. But it was interesting, growing up, just as I was really, starting to get like a young child's uh, more active interest in these things, I was aware that it was kind of fading or going on hiatus. Um, and that was a little, odd to realize, oh, we've stopped going. You kind of are expecting there'll just be a regular chain of lunar missions and eventually a base, and then there will be like cities, and then we'll go to Mars, and then and all this kind of thing. And so it was kind of this a bit of a confusion or disappointment, as it seemed like. But like, why did we stop? Um, and of course, I think in some ways that's because um, as a kid, you just think, well, of course you're going to go there because that's what the books show. And then it's kind of the same reason why there's not a city on top of Mount Everest, or the reason why there's only like a science station at the South Pole. I do have a colleague who spent time in that station. He was like, "Well, it's almost not terrestrial. It's so forbidding, and it makes you feel like you're on some kind of lunar base, including the way that the lack of the extremely dry atmosphere makes it hard to judge distance." Um, that's reminding me too. I remember for a birthday gift, much later, somebody found these. You could order from NASA these videotapes containing much more footage from the moon than the clips that everyone has seen. So the funny thing is they're not really as exciting or dramatic, right? They're longer stretches, and you hear the astronauts going back and forth. Um, but one part that was exciting was them in the rover bouncing across the lunar surface. And the bounces are much larger, and the astronauts are kind of thrilled. You can hear it in their voices. And you can also feel what they remarked on, which is that it's so small that you can kind of perceive that you're on something spherical, and especially when you're moving, I live in the Seattle area these days, and at the Air and Space Museum here, they've got kind of a permanent Apollo exhibit, and in there they show that the amount of ground covered by the lunar rover is like it's roughly the perimeter of the city limits of Seattle. So not the metro area, but the city limits. But it's still it's a long way to go, longer than I think I had quite appreciated, without that kind of a reference. So that's kind of, and then I should say, the other thing that was kind of right with it, my interest in Apollo was then kind of stirred an interest in science fiction, wearing my Star Trek shirt here. And one of the things that I think was such a big part of my growing up, and it's still with me, is the way that the fiction would inspire the science, and the science would inspire the fiction. There's this two-way process. And so there'd kind of be this excitement. I would hear something or read something and wonder, well, wait a minute, is this what somebody hopes will happen, or did this happen? And you could, with just a little bit of investigation, people would make it very clear, right? It's funny to look back. I know in this age of people in their alternate realities and disinformation, but growing up, it was like there was nobody disagreed. It's just that as a kid, you just ask, just ask a couple of clues, go to the library and see if the book was either fiction or nonfiction. You could tell it by the way that the writer would write about it. And that interesting boundary to me is just fascinating, right? The way that something inspiring can lead you to see, well, can we do it? And then once it's done, and once somebody else has done it, well, now you can do it. It was one of the fascinating things about the space race, and actually what's going on now, right? What do we have? Like, by my count, there are like 5 governmental space organizations and 3 private ones, right? Let me think. We got NASA, the ESA, the Indian space program, the Chinese space program, and oh boy, am I missing somebody? Maybe it's 4.
Well, if you're talking about now, you got the Canadian space program, the
That's it.
Japanese space program. Yeah.
Off by 2, so it's like this much more crowded field than in the days of Apollo. And then I've actually got a little calendar back here. A friend gave me showing SpaceX photos, like their Starship rocket on the pad, different view for each month. So you got SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Virgin Galactic also in the mix. Man, that's a space race, And they've got eyes on the moon, right? And further, including, man, I got to tell you, one of the things that I wouldn't have even, I don't know, wasn't even on my mind, like as a kid, was landing on a comet. That mission that happened recently, the Philae lander, that I actually landed on a comet. Seeing video come back from that was eerie and fantastic. And as an engineering feat, it's just, just extraordinarily difficult. And no matter how many other people are crowded on this space race field, NASA kind of remains the one to beat, in terms of the really stunning achievements. So I certainly enjoy watching when they propose something. You're like, well, it might be over budget, it might be late, but I bet they'll do it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. You mentioned seeing like fiction and science kind of interplay with each other, and I kind of I imagine what would it have been like to talk to people in like 1900, like the first decade, about air flight. I mean, they know that people are trying to fly, and it looks like this kind of one-off feat, and then you have the Wright Flyer that comes out, and people are like, oh, well, that's great, but what's it good for? That's interesting.
Exactly.
And then asking those people, like, do you think there'll be airports? I mean, they would be completely baffled. Like, what is an airport? And then, do you think you would ever fly? They're like, oh, that would never be that silly and crazy.
Exactly.
And I think this is the decade. This is like the 1900s for space, like the 1900s were for the air flight. This is when you have interesting conversations and kind of see, what people think. I mean, talking to them today about air travel would be pointless. It's like, do you think you get on the plane? Well, yeah, of course. I just got off one last week.
No, and boy, especially think about those people in the 1900s. For a long time, they thought, well, okay, maybe in a balloon, but certainly not heavier than air. You'd be like, how about 1 million pounds? What do you think about that? And that would actually be safer, than like crossing the same distance on the ground. I mean, it's remarkable. I've got a colleague who came from Ukraine to here when he was a teen, high school, decades ago. And when he arrived at a modern Western airport, he thought he was in the future. He actually, his career went into tech in part because of that aerospace inspiration. There were planes in the Soviet Union. He was like 5 years old when the Soviet Union fell. But the quality of the airplanes, the airports, the amount they were used was a completely different level. Arrived, I think, I want to say it was like in the Netherlands, was where the first transfer. And he just talked about, even as a modern, even knowing it was possible, just being thunderstruck by the scale, of it, the quality of it, the great condition that these planes were in, and how many people they carried, and at what rate passengers moved through the system. When I was a kid, my school library, as libraries do, sometimes they have older books. There was a book on aviation that was written before airliners had been built, so they knew it was possible, but not exactly what it would look like. But just like we are with space now, just on the threshold. So there's like a picture of like someday people will fly in large airplanes like this, and they kind of, it was, and the funniest thing, I never forgot this, kind of the schematic of it. They just imagined this plane on the ground and people just kind of pouring into it, like from all directions, like as if it had, maybe 4 or 6 doors open at once, coming up on stairs. And it's like, they weren't imagining like, sort of the jetway and the, kind of the ceremonies that we've put together for good reasons, which in some ways are kind of more futuristic looking, when that jetway swings out, and the way an airport looks when you approach it, than what they were imagining is people, coming out ways across the tarmac. I think for that reason, it is hard to imagine exactly how it will land, like we put our imaginations to work, but there's something about actually building it, along the way, that you realize, oh, this matters more than everybody thought. I know for myself, at least one of those things, and this includes even going out to Mars, I'm like, we just can't do without gravity. It's fun to experience microgravity. Actually, this again, this was years ago when I was working at a previous company doing the scientific software. For a special event, they got Charlie Mattingly, the command module pilot for Apollo 13. He came to speak to us, our company. We got to talk to him directly, and people went in line to ask him questions. And Apollo 13 had come out recently, which I just thought was great. And I knew that they'd actually used microgravity to film the scenes in the movie, using the same Vomit comet that the astronauts trained in. And my question for Mattingly, I just didn't want to, I was in line, I was like, what's microgravity like? What's that like? He was like, it's wonderful, like it just, he said, you just feel like you're always meant to. Making me, of course, super jealous and, ready to take that, ticket on Blue Origin sometime when they bring the price down.
Are you going 0G and get a ride on the Vomit Comet? That's a little bit more affordable.
That's a good point. I honestly, that's one of those things I know that there are, there's rides, right? There's amusement park rides and stuff that'll give it to you for just a few seconds. But that's a good point. The Vomit Comet will give you at least enough time to film a short scene of a movie, won't it?
Well, myself and my 2 sons, we had done that a few years back.
Did you?
Yeah, and so it's about 30 seconds at a time, and the total kind of weightless time is about 7 minutes over the course of, I think it's like 14 parabolas, they call them.
Okay. Wow. What was that like? I mean, I can imagine the transitions were probably a little nauseating, but yeah.
The actual weightlessness was great. I had no trouble with that. I did flips. You didn't even know you were flipping. If you had your eyes closed, you would have no idea that you were flipping because you have no sense of actual spinning. A lot of people want to flap their arms and legs. That's a good way to knock out your fellow passenger. but it was really good. I would say the most nauseating parts, the pulling out of that parabola, you're experiencing, maybe 2 Gs, two and a half
Yeah.
Gs. So that's probably the nauseating part is not the weightlessness, but the higher weight of
Yeah.
trying to get out of it. But it's not too bad. They have you lay down on the floor, stare at a point in the ceiling while you're doing it, and you follow the directions. It's really not a problem. It
Yeah.
is really magical though to see, like I think it was like the last parabola or the second to last. They, put some water in the air and to watch it like, the surface tension caused it to sphere up.
Yeah.
That was really neat. And then the moment it like touches anything, it just goes, it's just kind of really cool. But
That is.
it, I think it, you know, um, it's probably worth doing at least once. I
Yeah.
had gotten it on a Cyber Monday sale.
Okay.
So at that point, they were charging like 5,000 for it. So for the three of us to go was like closer to like 12 or 10.
Okay. Yeah.
Now I think it's like 7,000 a ticket, but definitely a lot cheaper than I guess Blue Origin is. Blue Origin has two prices. They have free,
Yeah.
and then they have millions of dollars. So
Yeah, they got they got two different tiers there. Yeah, one, yeah. Like if you can afford it, you're in this line. Otherwise, if there's something interesting about you, then you're in this line. That's true. Um, the microgravity, it's like just that it's kind of that unmistakable, quality we associate with space, because where else do you experience that, right? Except for minutes at a time. And it's so, it's so evocative. But man, I gotta say, like in terms of living and working long term, I just feel like that's kind of like trying to do with too little oxygen. So, um, the rotating space habitats that we've seen depicted, from anywhere from the series, For All Mankind to 2001, or if you remember in the movie 2010, when they're going out to Jupiter, they have the whole middle of the craft, rotating. And it's like, I know that involves some serious engineering. That's quite expensive, to accomplish that. And you're also then dealing with, like high forces, right? Something goes wrong, it'll go badly wrong. But it sure seems like one that you've got to solve if you're going to do anything long term. I even wonder, like, I don't know, think about, was it astronaut Scott Kelly was like an endurance, run of wasn't it close to a year in space, and depending on how you get to Mars, I mean, you're looking at about that same distance, that same length of time, and it's like, what condition are you going to be in? When you get there, it's like, if you don't find a way to induce gravity that's better than microgravity, even something that was moon gravity, right, 1/6 or something. I feel like, don't we know enough science by this time that like our bodies kind of need that if we're gonna send ourselves? So I kind of look forward to seeing when they try to do that in orbit, and what those first steps might look like. And I also wonder too, maybe there's some other engineering way to approach it. One idea would be like, well, maybe just have sections separated by cables. I think NASA tried something like that. I want to say it was 15 years ago or something like that. I don't remember exactly, but they're trying to see if just a cable would be good enough, to hold apart these two masses. And at that point, they were looking at electrical generation. I think the idea was like to dangle this cable through the Van Allen belts. You remember this?
Mhm.
See, like you pick up electricity. And the problem is that, that the cable doesn't want to, it's not rigid. So as soon as there's just the most minor perturbation, all of a sudden you get like a wave in it, the things they want to kind of, snap toward each other and, bounce around, and that's not good. And when you see that, you realize, that means that, for reliable rotation, you probably need something rigid, and that means a lot of material. And hauling that out of the gravity well becomes, difficult. So I don't know. I feel like I couldn't guess from here. Is it going to be cheaper to go out and try to get it from the asteroids, and do something that way? I don't know, but it's fun.
Well, I mean, back to your cable thing. if you don't have a force on either end, you kind of have that. But if you have like two modules like spinning, they're exerting that
It's
pressure
true.
outward.
Maintaining
So
tension. Yeah.
um, I think a bigger problem is like maintaining sort of that center of gravity, that center of balance. It'd be very easy for that to become off center. You need something constantly adjusting
Right.
so that the center stays the center. And then also the other thing is all the forces that the astronauts experience on outside is a force on that cable.
On the
Uh,
structure. Yeah.
and so that's but the original plans for the International Space Station included a module that was supposed to use a centrifuge for
Okay.
to test this out, but that had gotten canceled.
Yeah. Interesting. I know this much just because of, I don't know, just rank curiosity, is that like if it's too small, then it's almost not worth doing. If you experience different gravity at your head and feet, then it's it needs to be big enough that you can't tell. But you raise a great point, this thing about you're basically putting a constant force on the structure of the station, and you're using fuel to do it. So you've made the whole journey more dangerous and more expensive immediately. Anyway, it'll be fun. It'll be fun to see what happens on that.
Yeah, I could just see like two starships attached by big tether. They start spinning around the center point, and then one of them like slows down, and the other thing just kind of wraps around it.
I know. I mean, and on top of this, I mean, look about what happens when you do that on Earth. Here, you get a gyroscope. It's hard to change course. In fact, you use those to try to prevent course changes because of the angular momentum. So you definitely take on some more problems. One reason I guess it's been on my mind too is when you think about like, well, where would we end up? Could we really live on the moon or Mars? There's so much we depend on, not just gravity, but in terms of kind of what our bodies are used to handling or not handling. Just the problems of like the regolith dust. How sharp it is. A kind of and Mars has the same problem with extremely fine dust and things like this, that it starts to feel like, man, is just like I said before, it seems like bases, sure, living, not so sure. So, O'Neill cylinders are the other idea. You say, well, we just make a terrarium for people, but that's mega scale engineering, right? And you don't see those depicted, in science fiction much. And I think that's because, of course, the writers just like to say, well, say you just have it works in some magic way, and then we can use, sets from this or that. But at the end of Interstellar, you see just a moment of what one of those looks like, both inside and what looks like outside. Huge, right? An enormous rotating cylinder. And at that point, it's like you've somehow managed to solve the problem of how do you collect that much material and engineer it, and then, get it in motion. But that would be like, that feels to me like, as long as we're going to stay in the same form, kind of the right endpoint if you want to live in space. But meanwhile, NASA's been on this other track, which I think is really fascinating to think about. Is it us exploring space or not? Which is all the cybernetic missions, right? Boy, it's been fun to watch the success of the rovers on Mars.
Well, whenever you're talking about the lunar rovers,
Yeah,
with the astronauts going
yeah.
around the perimeter of Seattle, Washington, I was wondering how far the Mars rovers would have made in that same journey.
Yeah, that's a great point. They're having to be super careful. They're so much slower than the lunar rovers because the astronauts were like, time's ticking, and we're just gonna, we're here. We're gonna go as
Plus,
far as
they
we
were all
can.
fighter pilots and had sports cars.
They're all rolling the dice with their lives all the time, right? Man,
They're
it,
like, this is a payoff. You can't jump craters back at home.
exactly. And then with the rovers on Mars, it's like, oh man, if something goes wrong, the mission's over, right? There's no way to reach it. So everything is very planned, very careful, but it's still like from an engineering standpoint, it's brilliant. And I love the way that having a semi-autonomous robot is the fix to the speed of light problem, right? I mean, 10 minutes, 10 to 20 minutes for a signal to get out there. I mean, man, that's something to chew on when you think about just in our own solar system, what a challenge the speed of light proves, So it's like, no, you're not going to steer this Martian rover around. It's going to be making its own plan. It has to. So you just every day, well, here's the plan, and it has to execute and react, and make its own decisions about whether to proceed. And that's really cool. And especially now they got the little helicopter, it seems like that happens so fast. If somebody had, I feel like that 1900 guy who's like, well, maybe once, you get the rover over there, and then like all of a sudden, like almost before you can digest effects, like this one's got a little helicopter that, runs out and kind of scouts around for where the rover should go next. I mean, that's super cool. So, if you imagine, this going in, continuing to additional generations, it's not hard to imagine just a much higher fidelity cybernetic exploration, and I suppose that we'll always be doing that, right? I mean, we always prefer, if we can, to send a robotic probe when we don't know what the danger will be like. And what's changing is that these things are just so much higher fidelity, and maybe they can get we're learning from them and having them become stronger and so forth. One of the things that is, I think also very evocative and kind of feels like science fiction is, people have always imagined that as we explore space, that we'd have, in a sense, artificial companions, right? Kind of recognizing that the math is difficult enough, the environment is severe enough, that it's very useful to have something that you can talk to that's maybe as smart as you or smarter in some ways. It's very much like why it's valuable to have a dog if you're adventuring in the Yukon, right? You've got this thing which kind of has overlapping capabilities to yours. And that has been just in the realm of total hilarious sci-fi for a long time. But all of a sudden it's thinkable, right? It's that same cusp of something is, we're on the edge of it. I think, people have like Alexa in their homes, and that was inspired by like the enterprise computer, like what if we had something like that? And this idea of like this, it's not a person, but it's an intelligence that you can work with. And so, of course, you kind of see it recurring. You see it like in 2001 with HAL, although it's scary then, or like Interstellar, that robot TARS, which I thought was a very believable depiction of kind of what it would feel like, right? And that just seems around the corner, and it seemed to have happened very quickly, compared to.
Have you seen Chat GPT?
You bet I have. You bet I have. And I'll tell you, this is one of those things that I've had a front row seat to. A few years ago, I worked at Google for a year, and I worked on the cloud TPU team. And some members of our team helped OpenAI train the first version of that in 2019. And it was amazing then. Like you could give it a headline, it would generate an article. And because of the political consequences, maybe they didn't release the source code, but they've kept working on it. And then there was this thing called, and after I left, there's this thing called BERT, and there were some other ones that kept making headlines in my industry. And then all of a sudden, it's like they solved some important problems because the experience of salience, like the relevance of the conversation. Have you played with it?
I have. In fact, for a Christmas gift, I took some pictures of one of my family members and arranged it into kind of like a Dr. Seuss-esque story. And so I tried to write my own poem, and then I passed it over to Chat GPT to make it to Seussize it. And so I kind of did some iterations there. It really was kind of neat.
Yeah, it is. It's super neat. It's very dangerous right now because it makes stuff up, but once they solve that to ground the symbols, you're gonna have something very powerful. I was talking about rotating space habitats. I actually asked it a few weekends ago to help me write some code, just because I knew you can have it write code, and I asked it to write code for the equation for given a radius and an angular momentum, give me the gravity experienced by someone on the rim. So I wrote this formula, but it was wrong. It was subtly wrong, and but it was very believable. And it kind of made me doubt myself. And I, went off and I was like, wait, I know that's not true. Like, it acted like it was dependent on mass, and that's not true. And after getting confused and going back and sorting it out, I realized that I just used the phrase force of gravity when I'd meant acceleration due to gravity. But if I was talking to a human being, they would have recognized that, like, that's kind of they would know what I was asking, right? And that's
there's the question you ask and the question you meant to ask.
Right. And the line between these is, especially when you're using natural language, it's fuzzier. And when you're working with human beings, they know. They'll be like, well, they'll even ask, like, what did you mean this or that? Just before we get started. ChatGPT is not there. Yeah.
It's funny you say that, that humans know, because a lot of that judgment, that the kind of filling in the space and reading between the lines, as you were, the success of that really depends upon how well we know each other. And the success of that really depends upon, that's a result of shared experiences, shared exposure to different content, shared ways of processing and looking at the world. And the one thing that I think pretty much a lot of people might agree with is how varied lives are. Like, you and I don't live on a farm. My analogies of having to get up in the morning and milk the cows probably would be lost on both of us, and stuff like that. But at one point in time, there was less dissimilarness between the vast population. There was like common struggles, common expectations, and common things.
Yeah.
So ChatGPT may actually be better at reading between the lines in the near future than you or I will be.
I think that's very, very believable. To point out the errors that it makes is definitely just a kind of a warning, not to trust it too blindly. But the pace of improvement is really startling, and it really seems like a solvable problem at this point, right? You know what I mean? Like, to go back to your earlier analogy, it's not like we're thinking we can't do heavier than air flight anymore. It's within reach. And it's even though, as I was saying, I was inspired by Apollo from an early age, my career really has been in computing, and it's been a really great adventure, to especially, during my lifetime, to see some of the amazing advances. But the most startling advance to me has been the AI breakthrough that we're presently in. Because when I was in school, it was like the approach people were taking to AI just couldn't go further than a certain amount. And people believed it would, and just, poured whole careers into pursuing a certain line of inquiry, and it didn't pan out. And you've probably heard the term AI winter. You have an AI winter when people are like, yeah, it doesn't work. You can't let it won't do more than this. Well, we're in an AI summer right now. And of course, what comes with that is the dangers of overpromising or kind of over trusting it. But there's no doubt that there's been a qualitative improvement, and that's exciting. I don't think we've seen quite where it levels out, but again, we're kind of we know by collective imagination what we'd like, right? We know what we're looking for. We're looking for that kind of a co-pilot, to be with us on our adventures to exotic places. And it looks like we're going to have that. It's pretty cool.
I just think about AI and how it's, how it's actually being used, right? In terms of trying to optimize content exposure to people to keep them trapped in sort of like this deep thing and kind of create these vortex of ad revenue. And then on
Yeah,
the other side, you have trying to predict the market and trying to optimize that. It's just like I think if you look at the money behind AI, that has to be a huge amount on both those
yeah.
sides.
And this is one of the things that's kind of the strange, I don't know, the strange bargain, right? Think about the Apollo space race. It was like the government just pouring taxpayer money into it. I mean, and it was a huge amount of money, and taxpayers were okay with it for a while, and then really got tired of it once we demonstrated our superiority, right? Okay, you did your thing.
I know, just real quick, you know, I I think considering the forces and how Apollo evolved,
Yeah,
the surprising thing is not that we stopped after Apollo 17. The surprising thing is that there was an Apollo 12.
absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. And that is that is the better question to ask. It's like, man, how did you find that much political will? It kind of shows that people were wanted to maybe see what was next. It's hard to say. I don't know if you've read the book The Right Stuff, but I enjoyed it because it really recreated, it helped you understand like what the mindset was like, and that was the kind of thing that was happening here: single combat between us and the Soviet Union. And then of course there's also all of the cross technology between that and intercontinental ballistic missiles. And that's the thing about Apollo that I think makes it partly part of what makes it so inspirational is that we come in peace, for all mankind. The fact that it was absolutely about exploration, but its shadow, the same tech stack as you'd call it today, was basically fueling the possibility of nuclear Armageddon, right? It was the very same kind of equation, same kind of math, same kind of rocketry, all this kind of stuff. So it's really great to see what it has turned into. We didn't, the shadow didn't express itself fully. But nowadays, what you just pointed to, the fact that where does the money going to come from? It's not coming from taxes exerted by a government. NASA's got a much smaller budget, but it's coming from, like you said, ad revenue. Or like Blue Origin is being fueled by the money that Bezos takes out of Amazon, and he was directly inspired by Apollo. He's close to my same age. He kind of feels to me like the classmate that was inspired by the same stuff, and then when they got enough money, said, "I'd like to make a space program." And if you haven't seen he has a talk called Blue Moon, where he talks about what he's doing with Blue Origin. It's quite visionary, like he's not doing it just to do it. He's thinking about how can we move heavy industry off the earth, so that the earth can, the words he used were be zoned residential and light industrial. And it's it's kind of feeling like the earth should be a park and a place to live, not a place to, work out our heavy industry. That's a very bold, positive vision. And he knows he won't live to see it, but he wants to create the next, step in the ladder, right, for the next generation. But it's very strange to think about the route that happened. Who would have guessed, right? Like, and that's the other thing too that feels it's very strange. Here we are in the 21st century. Did you ever read much Golden Age sci-fi, like Heinlein and
Heinlein, I'm a big Heinlein fan. So
okay,
yeah,
so
and I discovered some of the lesser known people like Frederick Pohl. I don't know if you've.
yes, of course, yeah, yeah. My high school library, and then even in college, there were, they had a deeper catalog. It was really fun to go and read all these. And what's fascinating is I remember Heinlein in particular, he definitely imagined that a powerful industrialist would be likely to essentially have a private space program because they would, have the amount of money that you'd need, plus they wouldn't be hampered by like a Congress, right? You know what I mean? Like they'd be able to act more dictatorial. And if you remember the book Waldo Inc. by
Mhm.
Heinlein, but like Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos, they're like,
Are the man who sold the moon.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's so strange to feel like I can't believe that happened. I remember, at least, because Apollo is such an inspiration, reading those books, I remember thinking, oh, this is kind of an interesting conceit, but I don't know if I would have expected to live to see that pattern, play out. So I don't know. It's remarkable. Oh, and speaking of things I never thought I'd see. So one of the things that Apollo did was really depict, like, here's what it's like to go to space, the lunar module, so exotic looking, right? But like, here's a craft that doesn't have to worry about atmosphere. When you don't have to worry about atmosphere, this is what it looks like. But like, Buck Rogers and other, sci-fi paintings, they would show rockets landing vertically, or like even the Tintin comics, Tintin goes to the moon and it's the same thing. The rocket gets there, just lands vertically on the moon. And as a kid, I'm like, you don't know. That's not how it's done. It's done with you got a command module in orbit and the lunar module descends and this is how it goes. To watch both SpaceX and Blue Origin regularly land these boosters vertically, every time I see it, I can hardly believe it. Huge cost savings. Also something that we couldn't do with 60s technology, right? Slide rules and vacuum tubes is not enough to do that. You need kind of modern cybernetic tech stack. And again, they do it. I can't, it just makes me feel like, well, who knows what unbelievable thing I'll see next. I've often, younger engineers that I mentor, I've told them, I've seen things in the last 10 years I never thought I'd live to see. That's what's happening, and so it's very exciting.
It is. But coming back to Jeff Bezos' vision, I have seen the Blue Moon thing, and I think it's a wonderful vision. The thing that has surprised me with this project is some resistance to that vision in unexpected ways. I've talked to people who are like, we've messed up the Earth, we shouldn't mess up space too. They don't see the moon. There's a group of people that don't see the moon and the asteroids and Mars and Venus as like resources to offload the loads we place on the Earth.
Yeah.
Instead, they see it as things that are our version, as things that are special, and that by us going out there, we're somehow messing them up.
Let's talk about that. It's very interesting, and it's going to matter because we do these things for human reasons, right? And if we have a conflict about the vision, it's gonna play out. I can see that point of view. So in the Seattle area, there's beautiful Mount Rainier here, and it's extraordinary. It's wonderful to look at. People do hike up to the top of it, but there's no city on top of it. And if at night I saw lights winking from the top, I don't know how I'd feel about that, right? You kind of feel like, hey, there's like this thing that feels is like this spectacular, landmark. It's the same reason we have like, national parks, national forests, to kind of say, hey, humans are cool at what we make, but let's, put a cover over some things that are really satisfy our need for beauty and respect for the past. So I get that when it comes to like, say, I don't know, the side of the moon that faces us. But, when people start getting precious about asteroids, I'm like, think again here, and just like you're saying, you realize that right now, just to live, we are putting a burden on the Earth. And I think actually Jeff says it in his Blue Moon presentation. There's no planet that's as good for human beings as the Earth, nowhere else. There's no close second. This is what we got, The alternative, or not, no, excuse me, not the alternative. An alternative is the other approach, which kind of says, well, human beings should just really retreat. And this is a splinter movement, but it expresses the extreme, the voluntary human extinction movement. These are people who think that like, yeah, humans are bad for the Earth. We should just kind of eventually have fewer and fewer children until there's no more. That's as unworkable as a lot of other things. And it's also, I don't know, it's something about that has curdled, right? That's not the right look. However, it is true that, and I think people understand this these days, I'm really happy to hear the word sustainable used a lot, right? Yes, let's do things sustainably, that's a good place to put it. That's a good place to put our know-how. What I noticed, the last ingredient, though, the last thing you got to balance in the equation is what I think Jeff called dynamism. And I that's not a word you hear used very often, but it was an interesting concept to identify, which is like, yeah, we can do things that are sustainable, but we also don't want to live like we're, I don't know, crowded around the dying coals of a campfire, right? There's something in us that wants to do big things and bold things. And that, space is a good frontier for that, particularly the kind of stuff you can do, out on the asteroid belt or in orbit. And so, but that, I really feel like that tension is kind of high these days. There's a lot of people who feel like it is time just to let the campfire die down, and kind of, huddle around it. And just when I think am I misreading this? Like, you'll sometimes run across a book. There's a book I read years ago called Ishmael by a guy named Daniel Quinn. I don't know if you've read this. Do you know this
Oh,
book?
yes, I love that book.
You do? Okay.
Yes.
No kidding. It's funny. I mention that to people, and most people, I don't know. But like,
The most philosophical gorilla that
yeah,
ever in existence.
I know exactly, right? And he kind of represents now, I haven't heard him come out against the idea of Apollo or dynamism, but it's in there, right? It's kind of like, settle down, the rest of the animals are happy, integrating with nature, and that's good enough. And it's like, I don't know, man. Like, he didn't convince me, but I appreciate that he wrote the book. I certainly didn't find his argument, it's because he's consistent with his premise, right? And so it's something you can't discard. But I yeah.
I know it's somewhat a minor thing in that book, but I really loved how he kind of like framed uh, Cain and Abel, and how that was an allegory for kind of like the hunter gatherer people versus
Yes.
the you know the people that tilled the soil, and
Yeah.
how the people that ultimately won, they weren't going to change their ways, but somehow they needed to feel guilty about it.
Yeah. And to be able to to own their past, I guess, right? Man, if you're interested in that, there's another. This is we're heading off into philosophy here, but there's an author I read recently, Rene Girard. Um, I came to him through another author, Luke Burgis, Burgis, who wrote a book called Wanting recently, and so he was kind of, um, it's his retelling of Girard's work, and Girard spends time talking about this. Another facet of the Cain and Abel story, and to make a fascinating story short, and I do recommend you read it. He's kind of saying, whenever people live together in large numbers, a large group, a city, um, bad things need to happen, that the people in the city are not aware of. He calls it the founding murder, and he uses
Mm.
that phrase as a direct reference to the Cain and Abel story, because the first thing Cain does after he, kills Abel and has this conversation with God, he founds a city, and that it's an interesting next step. And Girard looks closely at that, and it'll give you a lot to think about too, especially next to the book Ishmael. Um, and that is something I think that is a little more. Boy, I know. Growing up, nobody even talked about this idea at all, but just the idea of the consequence of our dynamism, right? Um, and it's good for us to take a closer look at it. I don't know, to make another philosophical jump. Carl Jung would talk about integrating your shadow, which I don't think Quinn used. I can't remember him using that term, but in a way, that's what the agrarian winners did, right? They kind of integrated their shadow by saying, yeah, you know what? We've kind of forced our way of life, at the expense of our brother.
Well, I think there's a lot of people that eat meat every day, who, if they had to go butcher the calf, they would think twice about it.
Exactly.
And and they would put down and belittle and say how gross it is those butchers are, and yet still happily eat their hamburgers.
Right.
So you gotta own the whole process.
That's
You
exactly
know?
right. Yeah, I really think, and some of this has been so recent. My mother, uh, although her dad was not a farmer, he actually he had a ranch, but it didn't make money. He had to he was a cement contractor, to laying irrigation pipe. But they did a lot of farming. It was like small home farm stuff. So they had their own chickens and rooster and uh, a cow. And so my mom remembers they butcher the chicken, and she didn't always like seeing that happen. Sometimes she did, because there's this one rooster that was really mean to her. And so when it came his time, she remembered looking forward to that meal. But but the point is, yeah, I mean, just a generation ago, people were much more in touch with the complete picture of what it took for them to live, and you have to integrate it in some way. And there is something that's really it's not great about the way that we are insulated from it. It keeps us from naturally putting the brakes on certain processes that probably should. One of the terms you hear for this is externalities, right? Economic externalities. Oh, somebody else's problem. Yeah, if we could, the more we can do to close those circles in the right direction, I think the better it is. So yeah.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, we were talking about butchering the calf and eating, but you have the other side of the problem too, and that's the trash.
Yes.
I'm driving around Houston,
Mhm.
and there are some human-made mountains that are emerging. Uh,
Yeah.
that at some point, Houston's going to be like Mexico City, surrounded by these huge. In fact, maybe we should do a little bit more investigation in Mexico City. Maybe there's more to that than we know. But um, but I mean, you're right. We got to close the circle, and it's easy to leave the circle unclosed in such a big system as the Earth. But
Yes.
whenever you start taking humans and putting them in isolated places, those unclosed circles become very obvious very quick.
They sure do. I live in Seattle now. I grew up, spent most of my life in Tucson, it's environs, and just up the road, about half an hour, was the Biosphere 2. Remember this?
I've been there. I
Oh,
love the
good.
Biosphere story. I just like, oh, why couldn't they get their act together?
I
But
know. And I was in college when that was playing out, and I watched it with such interest because of exactly what you're talking about. There is something so educational about saying, okay, this is it. You're going camping. You gotta, you have to recycle everything perfectly. Go ahead.
then the thing that so there's a lot of inherent contradictions in the biosphere.
Sure.
Like it is okay to use all this technology and all this automation to create a primitive environment. We're going to have humans do primitive things.
Right.
But why not actually use technology and insight? I mean, why do you need the humans to actually hand plant the crops? I mean, it's like, why couldn't you have,
Ah,
it's just, it
well,
felt more like a psychological experiment than,
it partly was, and it's the people who were driving it and why they were driving it. I actually, on an airplane, I saw a documentary about it that filled in the pieces that I hadn't been aware of, which was the group of people, the Biospherians, like what they had done prior. It's quite interesting. I recommend it because they were fueled by a significant amount of idealism, and that's why they were doing it. It wasn't because engineering realities were forcing their hand. They wanted to experience, they wanted to have a particular experience, right? And they wanted it to be validated by the universe, if you will. But they weren't what you would call nuts, I mean, and how far they got is actually a testament to the practicality that they really did have. It's just that they were, I don't know, they had go fever, as you might say, for the fighter pilots would talk about, right? Get that go fever. You're just like, just light it. We just want to see it happen. And it's a pity, they kind of alienated the scientific community and ended up not benefiting from the assistance they might have had. But I love the fact that the experiment was tried. It was kind of framed as a failure, but if you've toured it, you know that it's an engineering marvel.
Yeah.
And this is not some tree house. Somebody put up with leftover lumber in their backyard. This is quite impressive. And the things that went wrong were instructive. I had an interesting conversation though with an entomologist at the University of Arizona about it that kind of revealed the depth of the animus, if you will. So I toured the biosphere about, I think it was 15 years ago with a friend. Came and visited, and I'd never been inside. It was open for the public. I'd seen the drama unfold when I was in school, but we were going to see inside. And so we did, and a guide talked us through it. And one of the things the guide talked about was what went wrong with the bees. They had bees in there to plant the crops, but because UV wasn't coming through the glass and the bees couldn't need UV to see, they got disoriented and confused, and they didn't thrive. They died. They couldn't figure out why they were having trouble. And so they said, well, this is one of the things we discovered. So for a different reason, a few years later, I was at the U of A for a seminar, and this was an entomologist whose specialty was ants and social insects. And she was talking to the computer science department because there was a possible connection between, there's an approach to AI, an agent model, lots of little agents, trying to accomplish something, and it was one of these things of like, let's see if there's any, not to abuse a word, but cross-pollination of ideas here. Is there something that computer scientists know about this kind of work? The entomologists don't, or vice versa. And there was no eureka moment, but I was kind of fascinated to see the description of how like ants maintain the temperature for the brood, and what an ant colony looks like underground and some other things. But I talked with her about what I just told you afterward. This thing about we don't really understand the world insects live in. It's amazing to think like, these bees depend on UV. And I mentioned this thing about the biosphere, and she was like, that has been known since the 70s. They did not ask, we weren't, if they'd asked us, we could have told them. And it was, I was like, okay, I hadn't talked to anybody who had that kind of passion about being excluded, from that conversation. And, that's one of the things, that was Bass, I think his name was, who funded it.
Yep.
Yeah. The thing about the private industrialists doing these things on their own, that's a disadvantage they have compared to like NASA, which because of its cachet, it tends to, be the benefit of sort of all the scientific knowledge that's available. It's that's much less likely to happen at NASA, right? That kind of thing, where it's, there'd be something in the literature that just wouldn't be known, in part because people want to, send it up the, send it up the line, right? And the fact that NASA intentionally consults with trying to find, the experts in all the field, and they know how to work with academia. There's a close link there. That is something kind of interesting. And that was an eye-opener, that conversation with that entomologist, and just her whole reaction. I thought, well, shoot, what, man, there's probably a lot of other things that I don't know about insects or biology that I think I know, right? But it's in a deeper journal there. Yeah.
Yeah, it is curious. The thing is, there's a part of them not being engaged and included. But whenever the project first got started, what was the reaction? I mean, were they like, "Oh, wow, yeah, let me help out," or were they like, "No, there's no way this is gonna work," or "These are just a whole bunch of crackpots over there. I don't want to have anything to do with them." And then after it gets built, then it's like, "Oh, well, they should have just asked," and all this. Like, so I mean, like
it's easy to criticize. That's a fact, right? And that's something people do. I mean, oh my goodness, you see it all the time, where people are like, well, if you'd asked me, it's like, well, if we had asked you, maybe there's some, maybe you'd be on the hook,
Yeah,
you
you
know,
would
all
you
that
have
kind of-
answered?
right,
Would you have supported it? Sure.
right,
Would you have just described the mountain, or would you have described the path to go through the mountain?
exactly, exactly. Such a man, there is such a difference. One of the man, that's one of the most fun things to watch develop over history is to see that back and forth between the certainty that we have before we start collecting data and then what happens after the data comes in. Um,
And then you have the reinterpretation and the
absolutely.
try. It's like it's crazy. I think about this whole pandemic thing.
Mm,
I mean, uh, I think we're in worse shape now in terms of public health response to a real I don't mean to belittle
I
anything,
know,
but to
right.
a disease that has um, a contagious disease that has a big effect on the population than we were before COVID. I feel like we've probably, uh, I think we've learned a lot of things from it. And I'm not sure they're all right.
Yeah, and one of the most disappointing things about it is kind of what it, how how a stress test will reveal what kind of shape the system is in. It's like, you know, as pandemics go, this was more of a fire drill compared to what it could have been, in terms of, loss of life and virulence. You're familiar with a book called Virus X?
I'm not. Is it good?
Yeah. So that one I didn't read. I just I saw the author interviewed on TV. I was kind of scared to read it. It came out mid 90s, I want to say. I saw, I saw it in the grocery store, kind of leafed through it, between looking between my fingers, because he was saying, I think he was saying, you take something as awful as Ebola, if that mutates in a way that it was, spread in a respiratory way, because of air travel, it could be an extinction threat to the human race. So he's kind of getting people's attention with this, the fact that air travel was uniting the entire breathable atmosphere of the planet, and could be a vector for
Well,
contagion.
forget air travel. What they plan to do is Starship, halfway around the world in 30 minutes. I mean, and having thousands of these launch a day. Uh, we're all connected at that point.
Exactly. And right now we're clearly, as COVID shows, sufficiently connected. We have been for some time in a way that, we came out with this book, like we were already over the threshold, right? Like it was not a question of like, oh, because of this, should we not have international flights? No, I mean that bridge had been crossed. He was just saying there's this danger. And then of course we had, the first 4 or 5 SARS viruses, that you kind of watch them spread through Asia and they got contained. We had adequate warning that like one of those was going to breach the wall, and we were all going to be having it. So it was very disappointing to see how clumsy our response was, and worst of all, that it became political. And that's that, like you want to pick something that should be a uniting event, and to have it become divisive was really really kind of a low grade there. In fact, in some ways, I can't believe we came through it as well as we did. And one of the things too that I think was startling to me is the gap between, I don't know, the gap between what was possible, what was in our hands, and what we executed. So what I mean by that is the vaccine that was the way it was engineered, that was brand new, to kind of create, these mRNA vaccines. My uncle, his company makes electron microscope scanning tips, and so they had a connection to the people analyzing the viral envelope. So my cousin sent us that video, and it was like, that was really, I've known about this for years, that we made scanning electron microscopes. You see, pictures of tiny things, and molecules and whatnot, and then to kind of show, yeah, we actually are able to do something really qualitatively different in terms of addressing this threat. That should have been it should have been a home run, but it just goes to show you that it's not all about the technology, right? It's like there's the health of the body politic, How well do we work together, level of unity. And then there's also logistics. You know, the one of the things, and I, you know, and like so many people, I kind of know what I've been told as far as this goes. I finished a book this year called How the World Really Works by Vaclav Smil, which I recommend, highly recommend that. Really makes you look at the world with like different eyes of like, here are the actual arteries and veins of the world, in terms of, supply chains and the resources used. And he mentions the response to, I think it's in that book that he kind of points out that like, for example, the US, because of outsourcing, we left ourselves in a position where we didn't have PPE when we needed it, which was, you know what I mean? Like, and it was something that, that level of interconnectedness and that inventory on demand has so many virtues when it comes to cost savings, but then people forget about what you lose in terms of a buffer, right? And the reason why you have a stockpile. And so then all of a sudden we were scrambling, with, the medical personnel on the front lines couldn't access PPE. That's the kind of failure which has nothing to do with technology and has to do with, logistics, gaming a scenario out along with necessary political will. So I don't know. It was there were, makes you think of, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, right? In terms of some of the things that, the new things that were achieved, and then some of the lessons that were forgotten or not even recognized as lessons that, really should have been. So I don't know. It happens, right? The whole thing it's interesting. We were talking about farms before. Somebody who lives on a farm is aware of, a wider scope than somebody who doesn't. And I do think that we are in a time now where we're sort of 1 to 2 generations away from some of these kind of modern marvels in terms of global supply chains or, air travel, certain things we depend on. And I do think there is a danger in terms of like forgetting what some of the necessary first steps were, or things you don't want to forget about, or maybe some ways in which we were lucky. And I don't know, some things have to be relearned. Here's a very evocative metaphor for me. Remember the tsunami a few years ago? It hit Japan. And I don't know if you remember reading about this, but there are stones, hundreds of years old, up in the hills, away from the water line. And they say, in Japanese, they say, for the sake of your children, do not build below this line, something like this. And of course, they're all overgrown, right? And there's, a huge amount of population but beneath it. And, and everybody knows what those stones are. It's not like a big mystery. It's like people experienced a tsunami before and we're like, what are we going to do to warn our progeny that there's something that happens periodically, not often enough for you to be worried about it, but when it comes, there's no defense except to be away from it, and they put out these stones, but people ignore warnings that they aren't reminded of on a regular basis. I think there's even, this cycle has probably been named after somebody. It's the way that I used the word fire drill before, which made me think of it. It's like, if all you have are fire drills, then you start to think the fire drills are made up, right? But if you actually see a fire, you're like, oh, that was awful. I'm definitely going to keep my smoke detectors up to date. I'm definitely going to, not store the oily rags, next to the water heater or what have you. And I don't know, it seems like it's a very difficult problem, because anytime you are, put yourself in the position of the people who might have seen those stones, who would say like, well, sure, we know tsunamis happen, but we'd have to come up this high. Like, it starts to feel superstitious, right? How can you tell superstition from, actually honoring, hard-won information? In a way, it's a kind of a difficult epistemological problem. You kind of can't, right? So I don't know.
And also changes in context, right? You could imagine millions of years later, plate tectonics and everything changes, and that level changes too, And right. But yet you've hammered in never build below this line, and
Right.
people are building above that line, and they're like, they're being mean to each other. Whoever proposes building below the line, and
Yeah.
it becomes completely irrelevant at some point because these other people had a different world they lived in, and
Right.
a less complete view of that world. So I mean, it kind of
Mhm.
operates both ways.
It really does.
It's
I
it's
mean, yeah.
it's uh it's very difficult. I think the net of it is, um, about judgment calls. Yeah, you got to
Right.
there's some. I mean, you can't just take things on blind faith.
No, it's like things have to be retested every so often. Sometimes the stuff that goes in the record is wrong. This one stuck out at me. The iron content of spinach is a decimal point
Yes,
error.
yes, I know, but it's still there. Everybody's like, "Oh, low in iron, eat spinach." Even I say that, and I even heard that story. It's just like,
Yeah, it's got some iron, but it's not, it's not the amount that, and that's why replication studies are so important. I do think that that's almost the only cure for how do you find out if a certain, thing from the past is true. Well, can you study it? Can you replicate these things at some rate? The world does change.
but
Uh,
you've got to imagine the people who live during the 30s and
mm,
early 40s, and who had seen the horrors of World War II, and kind of the system they created out of that, and
yes,
their response from that. Um, I think pretty much everybody in America really has no idea what world war is like, especially nuclear war.
oh
And
yeah,
I think there's a part of us that are like, yeah, it won't be so bad, this type of thing.
oh
And then you talk about the supply chain and all this good stuff. Uh, you know, at some point, it's going to come back and bite us.
yeah, and I mean, just what you said, uh, it's so true, right? Like not only do just I don't know if there's any living Americans who experienced it, and America was not invaded, Europe, um, they they felt it, they this is how it can really be. Man,
And
and
Germany and France being like friends. I mean, no one would have predicted that. I
right,
mean, Europe would not exist without World War II. That is one thing for sure.
modern Europe wouldn't. That's true, and especially when I don't know, it's really startling to think about, the Bretton Woods Accords, which laid the groundwork, to rebuild Germany and Japan after the war. Nobody was in the mood to do anything like that after World War One. It was about being punitive, and it was like it's only because that turned out so badly that they had the guts to propose this other thing, which you might call extremely practical pacifism. But right, like imagine even talking to somebody 50 years prior, like who was kind of the end of World War One and proposed something like that. They'd been like, "Be quiet, it's time for payback." It's it's really remarkable. I think that the study of history, you know, uh, when you've got the right sources, it can be so eye-opening. And even no matter how hard you try, just as you say, it's next to impossible to actually imagine what it's like uh, to experience the things you're reading about. So I don't know. I hope we can do the next best thing and at least give it accord it the respect it deserves, is not to remake the same mistakes. And failing that, I hope we can make them at a small scale. Um, what's happening with Ukraine right now is kind of, I think some people have described it as, well, that's almost like World War II battles, again. And I think it has certainly been a shock for a lot of people to realize, oh, that can still happen, and kind of what that looks like. My friend that I mentioned before, who came from Ukraine, when Russia first invaded Crimea and took it in, was that 2014, I think? So we were at work and overlooking, some streets in Seattle, Mercer Avenue, and he was talking about what it was like to see or to hear about, to see pictures from his family of like Russian tanks on the streets of Kiev. And he pointed out at the streets, he was like, it'd be like seeing tanks there. You know, he was trying to say Kiev is not different from Seattle in terms of being like a modern city and the way people move through it and live in it. He's like, it's this huge shock, you know. And so it's I don't know, it's a good reminder for those of us in the West who haven't been touched by that, is to practice gratitude by making sure that, you know, that our house is in order, right? You know, it's like, it's not we have things really good, and it hasn't been uh, it's not something that we can automatically have, right? You know, so
I know there's a price to doing that. I mean, just even having good city government or good county governments and stuff. I mean, there's like a level of participation that you need to have to keep that working. And I mean, I don't participate in any meaningful way. You know, and I mean, if I was trying to get my neighbors to all agree upon something, you know, that's a whole skill set that I would need to develop, which
yeah.
I don't have.
And this is something, there's some great names for this kind of role you're talking about, because all of us should participate as best as we can, but it really takes a certain kind of leader to accomplish it effectively, and it's harder than it looks. I've seen some examples. There's a guy, what immediately came to mind, there's a guy around here, gosh, I can't remember his last name, but he wrote a book called, I think, Strong Neighborhoods. He was a Microsoft product manager, and you know, there's a chance of earthquakes here in the Pacific Northwest. We get little ones, but we know that a big one can happen. And so there's been some consciousness raising about that, you know, about like, you know, are we going to know what to do in the case of a large earthquake? Because you might be without services for not 72 hours, but like 2 to 3 weeks, you know, to recover from that. But we would recover, you know, it's like, so his whole point was like, everybody acts kind of like they're going to be an individual prepper, you know, with their own supplies and everything. He's like, that's not how it's going to really work. You know, it's like you only need one person in the neighborhood who's got a generator that works, you know, one person in the neighborhood with, you know, this tool set or that tool set. So he was like one of these people organizing, you know, essentially, you know, block parties, writing this book, appearing on the news. I watched him talk at the local library. You know, I went to the one that he gave to this neighborhood. So I saw him in person. And it's kind of what you're talking about. It's like, it's less, you know, it's kind of this humble work, you know, but he's having to use a lot of the skills that he had honed at, you know, Microsoft, in terms of trying to get a group of people who don't, you know, have to work together to try to organize around a common goal, and also to kind of hit that right place of common sense and practicality, you know, and to get people mentally aligned. It was kind of eye-opening, you know, and it was good to see. And I hope we have, you know, more people like that. A lot of them are kind of unsung heroes, I think, kind of doing that sort of work, but it's
Well,
good.
and you know, there are certain organizations where you see it sort of being developed. You know, if you look at like community sports teams,
Right?
like Boy Scouts,
Yeah.
churches, organizations like the North Houston Space Society. So that's so,
Yeah.
you know, we're kind of doing that in like micro scale. You know,
Yeah.
at least it's like, you know, doing weights once a month. You know, it's not enough to make you strong, but at least you understand the process and you kind of
Right.
see the way to ramp it up.
And it's definitely better than nothing.
That's maybe, maybe, you know, I mean, it all depends upon. So you're like, well, I exercise once a month. I could let the diet go footy because, you know,
Oh,
I
sure. Right.
exercise, you know.
Yeah. 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 That's cool.
Well, Derek, it's been so fun talking to you, and I hope
Likewise.
someday we get to meet in person, maybe down here in Houston, up there in Seattle, or some
Yeah.
random place. Um, and I feel like you and I could probably talk forever.
Yeah, this has been really fun. It's been so enjoyable to see all the shared interests, and that we both kind of perceive the way they connect. It's been a really fun conversation.
Yeah, and I look forward to staying in touch. And I think Yeah, uh, I think I better not push the patience of the family anymore.
Oh, my gosh, we have gone over time. We'll pass on my apologies and thanks to your family for your patience, and I'll let you go.
No, I really appreciate it, Derek. It was a blast, and they've yeah, they anyway, they're understanding. So,
Awesome. Have a wonderful Saturday.
you too. Okay, well, take care. Bye bye.
See ya.